All right, so this is our first section. This is going to be the Gilded Age. We'll hit the next two sections before we have our test at the very end. But for right now, we can start with the Gilded Age, and we'll move on from there. All right, when you look at this picture, it's a few things you should notice. Number one of all things should be the color. It's supposed to be gold. And the reason for that is because it all has to do with the name of this section, the Gilded Age. It's a term not used anymore, but it is a term that was used quite often before, and it pretty much means gold-plated, henceforth the gold. The Gilded Age itself, that was coined by Mark Twain amongst a couple of other guys of his time period. And they looked at America and its growth during this time period. And this is like 1880s to 1900s, post-Civil War. And America's changed rapidly. And you can just tell from this photograph. You can see industry from this photograph. You can see the trains, the coal. In the top right corner here, you can actually see a riot taking place. Some important individuals that we'll talk about through the next couple of sections. And even the fire in the background to the left. Outside, things look great. You got factories, you got jobs. More jobs meant more production. More production meant lower costs, which means more things were available to more people. Immigrants are coming over by the thousands because America's a place to be. We're going through our industrial revolution. Sounds great, right? But deep down, things are pretty bad. You're going to discover that in this section, next two sections. Life's pretty horrible for the average person, especially in the bigger cities. And so Mark Twain and a couple of other writers of his time period have labeled this the Gilded Age, gold-plated. Great on the outside, but underneath, it's trash. I always use the comparison of a rusty truck. You can give it a brand new paint job and it can look great, but underneath it, it's still rotten and it doesn't tell the whole truth of the truck, right? So we're going to see that and we're going to talk about that a lot. This is the highest point of the Gilded Age. So when you take the state test, one thing they expect you to be able to do is, based on certain characteristics, what era is this? And so if they say this era is defined by industry, rapid growth, urbanization, immigration, factories, you'll be able to say, oh, that's the Gilded Age. Got it, no problem. All right, now what really spurs this Gilded Age to actually get to this point is a few things. The second industrial revolution. This is actually taking our second industrial revolution. Before is 1812, but it's so minor in comparison. A lot of people would just refer to this as the Industrial Revolution. But nonetheless, the Bessemer process. On your notes, I want to make sure you circle that. That's one of the big keywords we're going to have to look at and remember for the STAAR tests. The Bessemer process, and sometimes it's pronounced Bessemer, depends who you ask, was a process that was actually discovered by a blacksmith or gunsmith in Scotland. He found a way to make steel quickly. Now, it was on a small scale. Imagine like making tiny parts of steel. What he had done is taken pig iron, melted down to the point where it looked like molten hot lava. It was a liquid form, essentially. And by blowing air through it, it burned up the impurities. And by getting rid of the impurities and then taking that molten, melted iron that's no longer iron anymore because it's burnt up impurities like carbon and whatnot, you can pour it into a mold to whatever you like. And so on a small scale, he could do it for like gun parts, right? Imagine that. But somebody, a man named Andrew Carnegie from America, who was a Scottish immigrant himself growing up, came over to America when he was younger with his family, very poor, worked his way up through the railroads. He had the money and ready to invest. And he hears about this Bessemer process. And he goes to Scotland, he meets with this guy, and he discovers it, he understands it. He goes, okay, I'm going to bring this back to America. But Andrew Carnegie is going to do it on a large scale. He's going to fill something like this to your right up with iron melted down, blow air through it, and use that to make tons and tons of steel quickly, efficiently, and cheaply. It's a big gamble, but it pays off. It pays off well, so much that if you actually take a look, steel itself, to make 5 tons of steel, it took an entire day before the Bessemer process. But Andrew Carnegie can do it in 15 minutes. Huge difference. He would flood the market with his new steel. He could charge a lot less for his new steel because he could make a lot more of it, using a lot less manpower and a lot less in general materials. And he would just put out everybody else out of business. And he created a monopoly with steel. That's really key for the second industrial revolution to occur. Because if you look further down here, you see the pictures of a skyscraper. That's not possible without steel. You pour that melted steel into I-beams for buildings, railroad tracks, anything you possibly could, and you could build a lot fast. Before steel, if you want to build a building, you got to use brick as a base and wood, and this is pretty much the biggest you could actually get. So without the Bessemer process, the idea of skyscrapers and the rapid growth of anything, you can't build railroads. If you can't build railroads, you can't transport people. Everything's going to change dramatically because of this. And also, Andrew Carnegie become incredibly wealthy, have a monopoly over steel, but we'll come back to that in a second. Electricity is going to be widespread use for the first time. It's going to expand greatly, especially after Thomas Edison's light bulb, which we'll get to that next. And more factories meant more urban areas. And keep in mind, urban means city. Rural means country, the countryside. It's very easy to get those two mixed up. I always did when I was younger. And the best way to remember the difference is you've heard of suburbs, the areas outside of a city. And you know that, right? Because you always hear suburbs all the time. So if suburbs means outside of the city, then urban must be the city. So keep that in mind as it helps you try to figure out the differences between suburban and rural. Just keep that in mind, you'll be fine. This last one is actually, it looks like it's a picture of our hometown of Baytown, Texas, but it's not. These are the steel plants going nonstop outside Pittsburgh. That's where Andrew Carnegie would have most of the steel plants. And also is why they're called the Pittsburgh Steelers. All right, so your critiques do say you have to have a few technology advances during this time period in the Gilded Age. But I'm mainly going to stick to one particular one that's often asked on STAAR test. And that's also, I feel, Alexander Graham Bell. I feel like that's a pretty much giveaway. Everybody knows Alexander Graham Bell. He was known for the telephone, right? And his Bell telephone company will eventually become AT&T over a century, emerging and combining companies. But American Telegraph and Telephone and Telegraph Company, that's the AT&T we know now. I don't feel like he's worth going too much into because that's a pretty straightforward one. The guy I am worried about, that's asked often on the STAAR test, is Thomas Edison. Edison is well known for creating the first light bulb. He's well known for creating the first light bulb. But that's not what STAAR test asks. They're not going to ask a date, what did Thomas Edison create, or who created the first light bulb. The big focus they want you to understand is why is this so important. And at that time period, I mean, obviously, light bulbs are important. Lights at nighttime, great. But that time period, the big reason why it's so important is it allows people to work at night. I've got this sentence on here. This is probably the most important sentence in regards to this. Plain and simple. With lights, now you have night shifts, which literally is you're working twice as many people, so you're creating twice as many jobs, producing twice as much product. Imagine life now. We live in Baytown. Imagine plants, the refineries, no lights, no work. How many people would be out of jobs just like that? That change, that's a game changer, especially at that point in time in history. And it's not, granted, that's not the only reason why light bulbs are so important, but it is significantly asked constantly on STAAR tests. One thing that they should ask, that they haven't asked before, but I do want you to understand just in case, Edison does more than just light bulbs. He works with electricity. After you discover a light bulb, companies like General Electric, GE, they'll really pour money into research because they want to make money. And guys like Edison can create the next big thing. And so he's going to get more money to do more research and try to create more things. And he takes a real big focus on electric motors. Before electric motors, if you wanted a factory, you had to do it near your water route. You know, they spun a wheel. This was the first industrial revolution. Remember, it spins a wheel, spins a loom, pulley, whatnot. Well, then we get coal. And you think, no, if you got coal now, coal factories. But you still need to be close to water because the cheapest way to ship anything at that point in time in history, especially the heavy things such as coal, is by ships, waterway. And so you still had to be close to water. But with electric motors, now that's a game changer. If you can get the electric power stations out anywhere, you can have electricity anywhere, including factories. So that is a big change. Now, I do have a few other things here. If you take a look at this bottom right corner, these are other things that are created in a time. And in our first slide, when I talked about the idea of skyscrapers, wouldn't be possible without the passenger elevator, so obviously that's important. Electric light bulb we covered, telephone, obvious. Typewriter, electric typewriter, is pretty obvious. It does improve communications. And imagine going from a telegraph to actual letter being written. That's nuts. Airplane, obviously that's important. We're gonna talk about a star. The sewing machine, when that becomes electric, it's pretty interesting when we look at US history. When things like the sewing machine and vacuum cleaner, when electricity gets to the home specifically, becomes more domestic, not just in the business and wealthy people have it. But that opens up a lot of time for women. And what we actually see is that during times of technology advance, women will become increasingly more literate. And literacy rate among women dramatically increases. Now, that's not really asking about STAAR tests, but it does give you some idea the effect of technology, how far it can actually reach without us realizing it. Over here in this corner, I have this TED Ed. If you, or not TED Ed, but TED Talk. If you go to that, you learn about Edison's arch rival, a guy named Nikola Tesla. Not asked on a state test, unfortunately, yet, but he is a very interesting character. You should give that a link if you can. You can just go Google and search TED Talk Tesla, and you should find something. All right, so on this slide, there's a couple of lot going on in the slide, but there's one thing I want you to focus on. That's this word national market. That's the first one we're going to talk about. And over here in this corner, you can see that these are two railroad trains meeting. And there's actually a ceremonial occasion when they connected the Transcontinental Railroad. It was the first time, and it's actually this one right here in the map. They connected one part of the country to another part of the country as early as 1895. And it was more political, supposed to represent the uniting of the country after the Civil War. But over the time, they'll be able to branch off the Transcontinental Railroad with these other ones that you see. And you'll see that they'll be able to connect all different places. And by doing so, the railroad provides what we call a national market. And in other words, it gives stores, companies, farmers especially, a whole country of customers. Because think about it. If you were a farmer before the railroad and you're a little farmer sitting right here in the Midwest and you had your little wheat field, you could only sell wheat to local people. But with the invention of the railroad, you get your wheat to the railroad and the railroad can ship it out any direction, eventually all over the country. And those people way out in the big cities like San Francisco or way out east in New York, Philadelphia, there's big cities that don't have a lot of wheat, you can sell it to them. So the idea of the railroad creating a national market is important. STAAR Test focuses on the farmer perspective, but keep in mind it's business as well. Sears Roebuck out of Chicago, they took advantage of this and they put their catalogs on railroad trains. So you could get on a railroad train and you open that catalog, ladies could pick a dress out, fill out an order form, put money in an envelope, mail it to Chicago, and then Sears from Chicago would put a package on a train and ship it to you in San Francisco, creating essentially a national market. Railroads are the first national market, technically. They're the first ones to go state to state. It's just as important as the Bessemer process when we talk about this industrial revolution. And of course, those roads could not be built without the Bessemer process. Another thing I have bolded on the slide is free enterprise system. And you hate to get too much in economics when you talk about history, but essentially a free enterprise system is this idea where the economy, the marketplace itself, is free from the government. Okay, think of it like that, free from the government. You may have heard of capitalism or free market. In terms of this class and the test, it's the same thing. Capitalism and free market is essentially the same thing. But nonetheless, it's that concept that government stays out of the economy as much as possible. Now, we don't have that now. Like, we have child labor laws. And we have laws. If you're working in fast food, you have to keep the meat frozen. You have to wear gloves. We have rules and regulations now. But at this point in history, there's none. Like there's very, very, very little at all. The railroads, as a matter of fact, can take advantage of this, and they'll charge farmers whatever they want. If they think they can rip off one farmer but not the other one, they'll do that. You could discriminate. If you didn't like that farmer because of the color of his skin, you could do that. The government did not step in and regulate, not yet. But the Gilded Age gets so bad for people that essentially the demand will be there, and the government has to step in, or else these officials aren't going to get elected anymore. And we see that very first time ever with the Interstate Commerce Act. If I circle it, you need to circle it. You need to know it. This is really big. After farmers organize, they're getting ripped off by the railroads. They organize, they elect local leaders, and they push for these laws. They will create the Interstate Commerce Act. And for the first, and this is why it's so important, because the first time ever, Congress will step in to regulate business. For over 100 years, America existed, and government did not regulate business, did not touch the economy. The Interstate Commerce Act changes that. Now, it's originally meant for the railroads, don't get me wrong, but now that you've got this act in place where the government can regulate businesses from state to state, and that's all this is. Like interstate means state to state. Commerce, think of commercials, right? A business trying to sell you something, that's commerce. Don't freak out because of the name. It's pretty simple when you think about it. Interstate commerce, state to state business, right? Railroads were the first one. Now Congress itself will regulate, and that's just the beginning. Congress, a couple years later, will enact what's called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Again, don't be freaked out from this name. Sherman is just the name of the congressman who got it passed. But the word trust is a word we don't use too much anymore. But essentially, trust is the same thing as a monopoly. And a monopoly is when one company has control over a good or service. For instance, if I sold all the TVs and you can only buy TVs from me, I would have a monopoly over TVs. Now we don't allow that, okay? And it's because of Sherman Antitrust Act and the Anti-Monopoly Act. Antitrust, anti-monopoly, same thing. It means the government now is going to break up these huge monopolies. And most people argue like, why is the government getting involved, right? That's not laissez-faire, hands off. That's not laissez-faire. That's not free market. That's not free enterprise. Why is the government getting involved? Well, we came to the conclusion that competition is better for the consumer, for us. Now, if you look at this political cartoon, you have a highway of competition. What's blocking it is monopolies and trusts. And what's going to fix that is a federal commission is going to break that rock. Because think of we'll use a TV example. If I own all the TVs, why would I ever make the TVs better? I'm not going to make a bad product. Like, say half my TVs exploded when you bought them. What could you do? I'm the only one that makes TVs. I could charge you whatever I want. That's a big problem too. But if I make TVs and then some other person makes TVs, we'll call them Joe. Joe makes TVs. He makes a flat screen TV. You guys start buying his TV. So now I'm like, oh, no, I got to adjust it. I make a flat screen TV, but I make it 1080. Okay, Joe has to fix that, and he'll make one that's 4K. That's how plasma, LEDs, OLEDs, TVs kept getting better and better because there's competition. Companies had to compete with each other, and they couldn't charge crazy, outrageous amounts because then you wouldn't go to that company. You had choice to go to another company. So competition is key. It's important for American capitalism to survive. So that's why our government does step in. That's why our government has to step in to stop monopolies. So essentially, these two acts, the Interstate and the Sherman Antitrust Act, both these acts themselves allow for the government to step in. So the government will get more involved than anything else. So remember that when you take the test. Knowing the exact definitions help you, of course. Knowing that the Interstate Commerce Act was the first law where government regulates business, that's important. But when you see both of them, one thing you should know right away is like, oh, that's when the government will step in. Those are when the government's going to regulate. This political cartoon was 1 year, it was on Star Test actually. And it's supposed to be this Congress, right? The Senate specifically. And it's called the Bosses of the Senate. And when you look at this picture, the little guys aren't in charge. It's the big guys, right? You just tell that just your first glance at it. But those big guys represent the Steel Trust, Copper Trust, a Standard Oil Trust, Sugar Trust, Coal Trust. These are the monopolies. And you can look at this. This cartoonist, when he drew this, clearly he made a point to say Congress, they're controlled by somebody else. These big guys behind them with all the money, they're the ones in control, the monopolies. And so you see why many people started supporting the idea of an antitrust act. That's a pretty big deal time period. The actual here I have the Game Boy Monopoly, and that's unfair. I shouldn't put that there. Monopoly is not invented until 1930, but it was there to remind us of better times. 30s is the Depression. And so it's some better times like the Gilded Age. So some of these like railroads that they use are actually real railroads at one point. But nonetheless, I shouldn't have put that on this one. It's cheating, but it was from it was made in 1930s to reflect this time when America was doing so much better before the Depression. Now, I've got nothing bolded on here for a reason. I just really want you to understand that this is the kind of condition we're seeing in the Gilded Age. Long work hours, 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, terribly low wages, poor conditions. You break your leg, get out of the way, we're gonna hire somebody else. You die, too bad, so sad. Oh, you gotta use the restroom, you're fired, I'll bring somebody else in. The take it or leave it basis, that's what that is, right? Conditions are poor, there's no rules. Nowadays we have rules. You get hurt on a job, that company's gonna pay for your medical bills. There's nothing like that. As a matter of fact, one statistic shows that 1/5 of children under the age of 15 worked. And the statistic I've seen it say 1/4, 1/5, 1/4, depends on where you live. Maybe somebody's rounding up or down, who knows. But nonetheless, a lot of children were working. And they always teach you guys that, hey, these guys have little bitty hands so they can fit anywhere, which is true. But also keep in mind, you could get, if I had a 10-year-old working for me, I could slap them around, do whatever I want. He wants to use the restroom, slap him around, whatever, no, get back to work and pay them very little. A grown man becomes a bit more of a hassle, and you do have to pay a grown man more. So there are many reasons why children were the best labor for these businesses if they could get a hold of them, and why it was done. And you're thinking, where was the law? There is no law. There is no child labor laws. Not yet anyways. So keep that in mind. This is the conditions we see in America. Again, the big focus should be, this is the Gilded Age. American business doing great, the economy's doing great, but really look how life is. It's pretty horrible. And you see how we have the rise of unions. Now, I'm trying to go into too much detail, but students often have problems with unions. And I tell students when I have to teach them these things that's on a STAAR test, these are two unions, Knights of Labor and American Federation of Labor, also known as AFL for short. A couple of things real quick. With Knights of Labor, try to create one huge union for the whole country. American Federation of Labor, try to focus on skills like all carpenters or all steel workers. It actually doesn't matter for a STAAR test. If you understand these are unions, you're going to be okay. Now, you have to know what unions are. And this is an example I use in class, and I'll use it here as well. If one student comes up to me, if I'm the factory owner, and one student comes up to me, we'll say Nathan. Nathan comes up to me, and Nathan says, Mr. Brown, I refuse to work until I get a lunch break, a pay raise, and safety. I need safety equipment. This is ridiculous. I'm at risk. I could just fire him. With thousands of immigrants coming in every day to the Northeast, all your plant cities, you have Pittsburgh, New York, all the factories, everything's in the North. I would just fire him and get another immigrant, just like that. Everybody's replaceable. But what if Nathan goes to everybody in the class, all my factory workers, and they all make a list of demands? And now Nathan comes up to me and says, hey, I'm representing everybody here. You meet these demands, or we walk out and go on strike. Now, as a manager of this factory, now I've got something to worry about because, yeah, I can replace them. No problem, no big deal. But the issue here is it takes time to replace all these people. Got to train these new people. And even if I get new people in, they might not want to walk through the doors if there's a strike going on outside. It's pretty threatening. But say you do finally get people in, you still not all of them are going to be perfect. You're still going to have to fire half of them because that's the way people are nowadays. They're horrible workers. And so I got to train more people. So maybe, just maybe, I should listen to Nathan's and the workers, listen to their ideas. Maybe it'll be beneficial for me to give them a lunch break and restroom breaks so they can go potty instead of standing my ground and refusing to do so. It may be just easier to do that. Now, what Nathan did was unite the workers together. And so that's essentially what unions do. All the workers are united. They have one person to represent them. And that person would negotiate with the managers, negotiate with the owners, and if they can't come to eye, the representative of the union will turn around and go back and say, all right, guys, we go on strike, or we do boycotts. We can do a variety of things, slow down work, right? So this was a rise of unions, and they didn't demand crazy things. Politically speaking, nowadays, people argue about unions all the time. Back then, it was a simple 8-hour workday, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and for what we will. Like, actually have a life, I'm working all day, every day. That's not living, okay? Higher wages, which is self-explanatory. Factory codes and safety codes in factories. Yeah, maybe we should have hard hats. Maybe you should give us a rope to tie ourselves to, so in case we climb up, we don't fall and die, that kind of thing. Equal pay for women, still working on that 100 years later. Oppose child labor. This is my favorite one because everybody thinks, oh, America got smart and decided child labor was wrong, humanitarian, we're doing the right thing. But no, unions were very much responsible for ending child labor because children was competition. They want as many jobs open as available, and if you have children as an option and you run a business, a factory, you're going to pick the children because you can pay them half as much, and they're not going to organize to a union their children, right? So it was really unions that got together and said, you know what, you got to get rid of child labor. And of course, the most common thing we even see today is they want restriction on immigration because, as it was once said in a South Park episode, they're taking our jobs. And so that was an argument about immigration in general. Last thing I have on the slide, and I almost always forget, is real quick, the Samuel Gompers fella. STAAR Test often wants you to understand and know him. He was one of the founders of AFL. So STAAR Tests, when they do bring him up, it's pretty straightforward and simple. Sometimes they have a whole paragraph quote from this guy, and the question is like, what did Samuel Gompers fight for? He fought for the workers, either workers' rights or workers' interests. It's still the same thing. He was for the workers. If you ever see anything about these two right here, it's about unions, right? That's a big thing. If you know what a union is, you can answer any question. You don't have to know these specifically, but you just need to understand that they're unions. So that's one of the things from this chapter that students get. Now, we talked about Andrew Carnegie earlier. He's one of the guys who creates a steel monopoly. So just understand that Andrew Carnegie is known for steel, but there's always a massive debate. And they could ask about this in STAAR Tests. It seems like they're going away from this, but he paid incredibly horrible wages, forced 12-hour work days. If you try to form a union, he would fire you and anybody close to you. He crushed those because he didn't want them to slow down his work. The work was dangerous. People died. Like, it happened. They got hurt and they were just out of jobs. None of that changed his low wages and the way he treated his workers. But you'd think he'd be evil, but this man would donate millions to build libraries, to help universities. Carnegie Hall, infamous concert and ballet performance. If you make it there, if you get to play in that area, that's like the biggest, like that's a big one, It's a beautiful concert hall, essentially. He pays for that. It's not just named after him, he pays for that. And you're thinking, who is this guy? What kind of person would pay his people so little, but then donate so millions? And this quote actually says quite a bit about him, He said, the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He firmly believed the wealthy should give their money away. And so we often ask, is he a captain of industry? He created jobs. He helped the economy. He gave to the poor. Or was he a robber baron where he just essentially robbed from the poor? He took like their blood, sweat, and lives, refused to pay them more. And why? Why does he do it? Which one is he, and why would he do that? Well, we use Andrew Carnegie as an example, and he's not the only one in his time period. We're going to talk about a couple other guys. Andrew Carnegie has a thing called the gospel of wealth. And this is key. This is important that you understand the gospel of wealth. Circle that, underline that. He believed that wealth was given to him, was a divine intervention. Like, it was his hard work. He understood that. But he said, God gave me this and put me on this path. And he said, wealthy people, including myself, we have a duty, a responsibility to help poor people. But he refused to just give away money. He could pay his workers more. He could give them bonus. He'd go to the poorest area places and give away money. But he refused to do that because he said, that doesn't help. I can give you money every single day, but the day I stop giving you money, you're still poor. But If I give money to local libraries and universities for you to get a better education, right? So you can educate yourself and pull yourself out of it. You don't need me to give you money. You don't need me anymore. You're doing it yourself. And that sticks with you for the rest of your life. Famous phrase, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for life. That's how I could sum up the gospel of wealth. If I had to sum it up in just one sentence, that's the best way to do it. And now he brought this on, and many people agreed. And you actually see this in modern times. If you're wondering why do rich people buy paintings for some overpriced amount? Well, it's because that museum keeps the profit from the painting. And so it keeps the museum open. So while we usually think of art galleries and things like that as a way for rich people to show off their money, there's this backstory to it that goes back to Andrew Carnegie. You know, that's their job. Like somehow you get money to the museums, to libraries, you keep those open, they'll educate people, and people themselves can learn and take care of themselves. That was a big thing. Just remember the fish analogy, and you'll be okay with that. Now, he wasn't the only wealthy man, and he wasn't the only one to think of the gospel of wealth as important. He wrote the essay, The Gospel of Wealth, but even guys like John Rockefeller, who dominated the oil industry, controlled 90% of oil at one point. It became a monopoly, trust, right? He dominated it, and he did so by actually buying up other oil companies. He was actually pretty poor at one point. One-bedroom shack, newborn baby. His partner says, I'm out of the business. I'm quitting. I'm giving up on refining oil. Yeah, because at the time, a lot of people were doing this. They were trying to refine oil, but nobody had a good product. Essentially, one company refined oil to turn to kerosene. You could buy from them 1 week, and it'd be a good product, and next week, it was a horrible product. And the next week after that, it was just way different. You never knew what you were getting. Essentially what Rockefeller did, John Rockefeller created a Standard Oil company because he would make a standard for his oil to go by. All his oil would meet these minimum standards, and he knew what you were getting with you when you bought from him. So more people bought from him, and he grew his business. And when he grew his business, he started buying out other oil refining businesses. And he would just go to them, I'll pay you this much, buy you out, take over the business, right? And he could do that because he was wealthy. And then it got to the point where some people refused. His competitors refused to give up. They refused to sell out. They thought, I can beat you. I can copy and do the same thing you did. And Rockefeller took advantage of his wealth at the time. And he would go to the railroads, and he would tell the railroads, hey, if you ship out this other company's oil, you will no longer get my business. And if you're the railroad, you're looking at this like, hey, we get a lot of profit from Rockefeller Oil, from Standard Oil Company. This other little company is not going to give us anything in comparison. So the railroad company would quit shipping out the other company's oil. They refused to do so, and then the other company would go bankrupt, and Rockefeller comes back and says, I bet you sell your company to me now. Now, illegal? Nope. It's perfectly fine. He can do that. There's no laws against that or anything like that. Railroads, their hands are tied. They have to do that. This is why they create Interstate Commerce Act. This is why they create the Antitrust Act, because his monopoly had too much control. Like, he dominated everything. He controlled all the oil. But he did the same thing Carnegie did. He gave millions to build the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Plaza, if you ever heard of it. These guys, they created jobs and gave money away for educational purposes. But workers also suffered quite a bit. And you see his quote here, charity is useful only if it helps you to gain independence. These weren't totally evil men. And so the debate goes on. Even modern times, you can argue, were these guys good or evil, villains or heroes? This political cartoon actually shows you the Standard Oil. The tentacles are grasping everything from the White House to politicians to Congress itself. And that was what this particular artist was trying to get the message across, is that this monopoly is controlling everything in government, which back then it was true. Like, they literally just took money. It wasn't even campaign money. It was just take this money, do what I asked, please. But you can see the idea behind that is very anti-monopoly, very supportive of the Antitrust Act, ending monopolies. Now, this slide, you're going to laugh when you see the people like, why do you have these guys on here? Well, I actually have this on because it turns out over time I realized students aren't familiar with basic words, right? Entrepreneur, it's someone who starts a business. They take all the risk. That most people would know that, right? So that might not be one that's difficult. Philanthropy, that is essentially what Andrew Carnegie talked about, giving money away. If you see philanthropy and you think charity, you'll be fine in the purposes of this class and for the STAAR test. It's simply just charity. Philanthropy is just simply charity. I have three guys here that I think of, and I've always thought of these guys. When I think of entrepreneurs, I think of Bill Gates from Microsoft. I think of Zuckerberg from Facebook, and Steve Jobs from Apple. These guys are entrepreneurs. They either took a product and made it much better and took all the risk, or they created products, right? But these three also are really big in giving on charities. Bill Gates has a Bill and Melinda Foundation. He signed on to promise to give away 50% of all his money before he dies and the rest of it after he dies. There's very few billionaires out there like that. Mark Zuckerberg gives quite a bit of money as well. I remember when Ebola broke out in Africa, within a couple of weeks, he had donated $1 million to help stop it. And this was pre-COVID, before people realized how important money was to fight off disease, how much difference it can make. And Steve Jobs was the same way. But all these people gave lots of charity, and all these were entrepreneurs. Now, modern times, I would argue you can be an entrepreneur, but not a philanthropist. And so I always ask students, like, who else would you add to this list? And the two biggest ones I get in 2023, at least, is Elon Musk, which I agree, entrepreneur by far, not much of a philanthropist, only what he can use for his taxes. And then the other guy gets probably the same way, Jeff Bezos. You know, he's an entrepreneur. He took Amazon from nothing to what it is today. And he does give money to charity, but when we actually criticize it, again, it's only a small percentage. Unlike other people who aren't entrepreneurs but still philanthropists. Think of Leonardo DiCaprio. He's giving away 50% of his money to help fight climate change. Now, that's philanthropy, but he's not an entrepreneur. Didn't create jobs. And even now you can argue that guys like Zuckerberg, they don't really create jobs. Tech industry does not create jobs. When you buy Instagram for millions, there are 13 employees there. This is not like Andrew Carnegie Rockefeller, where their products created jobs as well to help the economy. But you can go in details and debate that. But just make sure you know these two words. That's the main thing I just want to make sure you get across from the slide. Most students know entrepreneur. Philanthropy is just an unfamiliar word. But you're going to see that when you see any reference to Andrew Carnegie or the Gilded Age. So it's important you know that. Last event we really have to talk about in this section before we wrap it up is the Haymarket Affair of 1886, sometimes called the Haymarket Square Affair. Make sure you know this, circle it. This is just one of many issues or events that unions deal with, but we talk about it. It's asked on STAAR test because it's a perfect example. I'm not going to get into too much detail about it, but previously there was a clash the day before, and the union called for a rally at Town Square, and this is often called Haymarket Square, the center of town. Some people call these plazas nowadays. With the Haymarket Square Fair, essentially what happens is there is a rally. The union reps are leading the rally. They're getting people, we got to stick together, guys. We can do this, blah, blah, blah. Then the police show up. Police chief says, step down, while the rest of the police start surrounding the crowd. And then suddenly a bomb goes off. Police open fire. And of course, people are packing in the crowd and they start shooting back. In the end, 7 cops die, 4 workers die, 8 workers are arrested, 4 are actually executed. And now in the end, only one of these 8 was even a member of the union. They were Knights of Labor. Only one was an actual member of a union. But the public looked at this, and and I will argue now, when cops die in any exchange, the opposing antagonist is always the enemy. In this case, it was a union. People looked at unions when this stuff happened, and they said unions are anarchists, meaning they don't like government at all. They don't like law. They don't like order. They just want total revolution. They're lazy. Unions got a bad rap. Okay, so much that by 30 years later, by 1910, only 5% of all workers were union members. Only 5%, that's it. So STAAR test does point this out. It says, hey, as industry rose, so did union membership. And that's true. I mean, union membership was non-existent until you have industry. But in the end, I hate it when STAAR asks that question because it really stops. The Haymarket Square proved that oftentimes when unions got together against business, violence was always an issue. And it also points out the government does not side with the workers. The government will always side with the business over the unions. For the federal government, your property rights were more important than workers' rights. and especially in the early on this time period. But again, this is a Gilded Age where workers have it tough, people have it tough. But if you took a step back and looked at America, you're like, oh, it's great. On the outside, gold-plated, it's gilded, it's nice, but not underneath it. The violence, poor people, it's a pretty tough life for the average American. Finally, I just want to summarize it with this. The Gilded Age, essentially this industry and the factories created a system where it started separating owners from workers. Imagine this. This is hard to wrap your head around. But before factories, if you were an apprentice or an assistant, you worked with the shop owner side by side. And so you worked together. So in one point of view, the Industrial Revolution created a separation between the workers and the managers. You had one person managing over several people, not working with them. And so actually you can imagine the tension that happened, like enemy versus enemy is what this created. Blue collar versus white collar. Have you ever heard that? Blue collar were the guys in blue overalls. White collar was a guy with a tie. That's where that comes from, all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. So all this is building up. All this sets the stage for people to say enough's enough and demand change, and they demand that the government themselves step in and fix it. And that's going to lead us essentially to the progressive era. We have one more section before the progressive era, and then we wrap up the whole unit. But that pretty much summarizes the Gilded Age.